Good evening and welcome. This is the fourth webinar from the Middle East Center in Oxford. My name is Eugene Rogan, and as director of the center, it's my great pleasure to be welcoming you to tonight's seminar presentation on Saudi Arabia. Our speakers will be Professor Madawi Al-Rasheed from the London School of Economics, author of the forthcoming book, The Sun King, Reform and Repression in Saudi Arabia, which will be due out in December of 2020. And Ben Hubbard of the New York Times, whose most recent book, MBS, The Rise to Power of Mohammed bin Salman, has been on the lips of everybody talking about what is going on with Saudi Arabia under its influential and impetuous crown prince. Ben, Madawi, what a pleasure to welcome you both to the Middle East Center's webinar. How would you like to begin? Did we ever agree an order of proceeding here? Are we starting with you, Madawi?
Yes, I think so.
I should have known that before we started. Please, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Eugene, and thanks for this opportunity at difficult times, but at least we can connect through Zoom. I'll be talking about my forthcoming book, The Sun King, but with a special reference to populist nationalism. Before I start, I would like to just set the scene by saying that the rise of MBS wasn't really in 2017 when he was appointed Crown Prince. It goes back a couple of years before that. And I see the rise of Mohammed bin Salman as a result of the Arab uprising in 2011, when Saudi Arabia, specifically the ruling family, felt the pressure of the rising tide of protest in the region. And it was during the time of King Abdullah when the Saudi leadership looked a little bit lagging behind in terms of its reforms, in terms of its outlook. So Mohammed bin Salman, I think, was a product of that time when the regime was in fear. And also the Western allies of Saudi Arabia feared the outcome of the Arab uprisings reaching Saudi Arabia. So the search began to look for a young, energetic, a social reformer to become the face of Saudi Arabia. And all that was meant to come as a substitute or to mitigate against any kind of political change reaching the kingdom. And based on that, I think the idea of Mohammed bin Salman springs from a kind of discourse that still adheres to a kind of Oriental despotism, in the sense that in order to reform the so-called conservative Saudi society, the so-called lazy Saudis, the so-called religious fanatics in Saudi Arabia, there is an inevitability of repression and coercion for a new Saudi Arabia to emerge, meaning that a modern Saudi Arabia, but without the fundamental pillar of modernity, and that is political change and moving the political system from an absolute monarchy to something more in line with what was demanded across the region, across the Arab world. So Mohammed bin Salman was the choice. And Mohammed bin Salman did a series of reforms, and we all know what these reforms are. They touch the fabric of the religious establishment, the religious sphere. They also move to the social fabrics of Saudi society, in the sense that he started a series of reforms when women could begin to drive. There is an increased visibility of women. There is a fun culture introduced in the form of entertainment. And also economic reforms, which were meant to move the state-centered, oil-based capitalist economy of Saudi Arabia that is tied to a global world of oil consumers into a sort of a neoliberal economy where the state starts selling some of its assets. And this was all summed up in Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Program. However, part of that so-called reform was repression. Hence my book's subtitle, Reform and Repression in Saudi Arabia. I do challenge the idea that in order to reform Saudi Arabia politically, socially, economically, and religiously, you need a fair amount of repression and coercion. And I show that in addition to repression, which is actually documented, and I don't want to waste the short time I have discussing the abuse of human rights, the detention campaigns against members of his own family, let alone the feminists, the activists, the Islamists, the professionals, intellectuals, etc. Even economists got arrested. That is well documented, and anybody who's interested in that, they could consult, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN Council on Human Rights. What I want to focus on is on the subtle ways of making that kind of package, social, economic, religious reform without political change, work in Saudi Arabia. And Mohammed bin Salman launched a new kind of nationalism that I would call a hyper-nationalist narrative, summed up by hashtags on Twitter such as Saudi Arabia is great, or make Saudi Arabia great, or even Saudi Arabia for Saudis. These are the signs of this nationalism. But how did we get to here? As I have a side of me that likes history, I would say that the idea of Saudi nationalism or nationalism in Saudi Arabia was actually deeply in flux. It wasn't taken for granted. Nationalism itself was contested. But if we look at Saudi Arabia in a diachronic way from the beginning of the 20th century, I identify three phases that bring in some kind of nationalism. The first one is religious nationalism that was associated with the Wahhabi tradition. The Wahhabi tradition was meant to homogenize society in the name of bringing it to the right Islamic path. And as such, it became the religious nationalism of Saudi Arabia, and we could discuss that in the Q&A. But this period, and it was actually at the beginning of the 20th century up to the 1960s, where all regions of Saudi Arabia had to be submerged under the banner of becoming true Muslims. And as in Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Algeria, nationalism in its sort of secular, in inverted commas, version helped to homogenize the nation. I think religious nationalism and Wahhabism in particular played that role, but it was actually based on a religious dogma, on religious text, on ways of behaving, ways of conducting your legal affairs that had to be homogenized in Saudi Arabia in order to achieve the unity of Saudis as true Muslims. So that was the first phase that lasted until the 1950s and late 1960s. But then something else happened, and Saudi Arabia thought that the Islamic utopia was created inside Saudi Arabia, and there is no other ways to continue to Islamize society, to unify it under the banner of Wahhabism. So from the 1960s, because of a particular historical international context, Saudi Arabia shifted to a pan-Islamic identity. So pan-Islamism became the pillar of what it means to be a Saudi. Saudis began to propagate the mission. So once the mission of the Islamic utopia was accomplished inside the country, there was a deliberate attempt to spread it around the world. And this was encouraged by an international context, specifically the Cold War, when Saudi Wahhabism became an arm of foreign policy used and encouraged by countries like the United States, Britain, who saw in the propagation of the Islamic utopia a counter trend against the challenges of the 60s and 70s with Arab nationalism, socialism, all the kind of forces of Abdel Nasser and others. So Saudi Arabia began to adopt this pan-Islamic identity and created institutions whereby the ethos of this pan-Islamism is embedded, such as Islamic universities, Islamic banking, Islamic youth organization. And this was done actually under King Faisal. However, we come to 9/11, and it was the shock that this Saudi-sponsored, Western-approved and encouraged type of pan-Islamism led to kind of undesirable consequences, such as 9/11, the emergence of a global jihadi movement that became a menace not only to the West, specifically to the US in 9/11 and in other parts of the world, but also inside Saudi Arabia. Let's remember that Saudi Arabia went through a very, very bad period during the terrorism crisis, which started in 1979, but continued and became very, very acute between 2003 and 2008, when Saudi cities were targeted. So that kind of pan-Islamic identity was gradually being abandoned in order to create a modern Saudi nation. And today, Mohammed bin Salman takes it further by promoting Saudi Arabia and promoting Saudi nationalism. And the ingredients of this nationalism are different from those that were used in the 20s, 30s, and then during the pan-Islamic period. So Mecca and Medina are no longer the pillars of this new Saudi nationalism. There is an attempt to find other sort of secular sites for this nationalism, such as Al-Ula, such as the archaeological digging, in terms of tourism, pushing Saudis to appreciate their pre-Islamic heritage, their the Wahhabi, the pan-Islamic kind of orientation, and making it more focused on other ingredients. And of course, like any national narrative, the Saudi one is in a state of flux all the time. And it is based on forgetting and remembering, like all nationalisms around the world. But we are now in this particular period. However, this populist nationalism that is encouraged today by the Crown Prince, and it has its own supporters, is like any other nationalism. It tends to unite people, but also to divide them. It tends to include and exclude. And what is really interesting is this populist nationalism goes against the Vision 2030 and the sort of opening up of Saudi Arabia to global investment and capital, and bringing a new entertainment that is really focused on Western pop culture. So while he wants to open up the economy, at the same time, there is this discourse that is directed against immigrants. And by immigrants, it's not only the post-oil or post-Second World War II migration to Saudi Arabia. It is targeting also the people who had been living in Saudi Arabia for decades, such as people from the Caucasus, people from China, people from Thailand who are Muslims living in Mecca. So this kind of nationalism has its dark side, like we all know, and we have seen that. And it suffers from certain contradictions, like all nationalist narrative. First, let me just go through a list of certain kind of evidence to document what I'm talking about. There is the empowerment of women, and women become the vanguards of this new Saudi national narrative because they are icons of modernity. And at the same time, we see that women are promoted as ambassadors, as members of the Shura Council. There is a deliberate attempt to feminize the nation. But at the same time, the same nationalism doesn't allow a Saudi woman to give her nationality to her children if she's married to a foreigner. There are several cases in the books where women are denied custody of their children whose fathers are not Saudis. At the same time, there is this sectarian discourse that is used in the war in Yemen. So the war in Yemen at the beginning to 2015 was projected as a jihad against those infidel Zaydis. There is also an invocation of genealogies and tribal belonging, especially in the dispute with Qatar, while at the same time we're supposed to be all Saudis. There is actually a sinister side, and I should stop as Eugene is making signs that I should. There is the sinister side of this nationalism that is leading to a discourse about treason and criminality, and it is that populist nationalism that led to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. It is the nationalism that promotes and encourages citizens to become policemen. So the citizen policeman is an outcome of this nationalism. So to just conclude, I want to say that repression might be obvious, and all regimes use, such as the Saudi one, would use it to promote a new era, a new vision. And it is very obvious, you could document it, but what I'm talking about, this populist nationalism, is a subtle way of achieving a similar kind of outcome. Thank you for listening. And I'm sorry if I exceeded my limit.
On the contrary, and I thank you for a very concise and brilliant analysis of where Saudi Arabia has come to arrive at this moment. I particularly like the way in which you periodize Saudi history, because it so breaks with the way in which the Crown Prince has spun a kind of liberal Saudi Arabia before 1979, a post-1979 clampdown Saudi Arabia of very zealous religion, and then the new age he wants to usher in. So it's very good to have a kind of counterpoint to the official periodization of recent Saudi history. I'm sure it's a point we're going to come back to in the subsequent Q&A. And I'd like to hand on to Ben. The reason why I'm going to try and keep you both to sort of 10 to 15 minutes each is just because we'll have a little discussion and then I want to leave time. The questions are already coming in. So listeners, stick with us. We are definitely getting to your questions. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short so we can do as much discussion as possible. I think that my experience with Saudi Arabia is certainly much shorter than Dr. Madawi's. I mean, I basically, was a Middle East correspondent working in the Middle East. 2013, my editor said, I think you should try to go to Saudi Arabia. I got my first visa and I went, and I spent a lot of time in the Arab world before that, spoke Arabic. And so it wasn't completely new to me, but in terms of on the ground experience, it was a very new place. I had lived in Egypt and I traveled elsewhere, but Saudi Arabia, even if you were used to the Arab world, was an incredibly different place. And sort of looking back now, from 2020 to 2013 or to 2015, when Mohammed bin Salman really comes onto the scene, we sometimes forget how dynamic of a period it has been and how much kind of accelerated change we've seen on so many fronts. When I went to Saudi Arabia before 2015, it was really a boring place. I mean, it was a place that was ruled by an elderly king. There was this idea of sort of this family council that would, of the senior princes who would divide up the files and they would rule by consensus. And any sort of Saudi expert that you would talk to would tell you, this is the way it is in Saudi Arabia, and this is the way it's going to be. You obviously had deep social conservatism, and music and arts and things like that were sort of looked down upon in a lot of places socially, and also sort of from official narrative. Saudi Arabia had influence in the region, but it was always trying to exercise it behind the scenes, sort of working behind the curtain and paying people off in various places, but not sort of very activist foreign policy. And this is kind of the way it was. And so being a journalist going there, it was a very sort of difficult, you would go and there kind of wasn't all that much to see. It was sometimes hard to figure out what was going on. And then 2015 comes along, and then we very quickly realized that sort of MBS was the kind of figure that we don't see in the Middle East very often. And one indicator of that is the fact that here he's been on the scene for 5 years. He's not the king of Saudi Arabia, and there are already multiple books written about him, including my own. There are kings of Saudi Arabia who never had so many books written about them. So, it's been a time of dramatic change, and and I won't sort of rehash a lot of the things that Madawi brought up about what we've seen. Socially, we've seen sort of, we've seen trying to sort of put large parts of conservative society back in the box, whether it's, taking the power to arrest away from the religious police, extensive arrest campaigns against conservative clerics. There's obviously all the reforms that have had to do with the women, things that to us may seem very common, but inside of Saudi Arabia are quite a big deal. Obviously, women driving sort of got the most attention. Also, things like allowing physical education classes for girl students. I mean, this is something that you didn't have in Saudi Arabia before, and they're rolling these things out. Arts going from being sort of something that was considered Western and looked down upon in music, now they're inviting, almost any Western musician that they can to come perform in Saudi Arabia. Politically, it's also been a very dynamic time. You can gauge that by the war in Yemen. Saudi Arabia had a large military, and they spent tens of billions of dollars on weapons from the United States, the UK, and other countries, but they have never intervened militarily in that kind of a way. And within a few months of coming on the scene, when he was still deputy crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman dispatched the Saudi military to intervene in Yemen, and they're still there. And we've seen all sorts of other, we could talk about sort of the standoff with Iran across the region, the various ways that Saudis have done that. The famous sort of detention and forced resignation of Saad Hariri in Lebanon, where I am. I mean, these are the kinds of things that nobody ever expected from Saudi Arabia before, because they were never that assertive and never that, I think many people would say, aggressive. And I would agree with the subtitle of Madawi's books, that I think when you look back over this very quick succession of events, the two themes that really rise up are reform and repression. On one hand, there have been dramatic changes in terms of social life in Saudi Arabia. There have been, I would say at this point, at least dramatic initiatives to try to reform the economy. I don't think those have made as much progress, certainly as Mohammed bin Salman or his advisors would like, but there's certainly been a lot of attention put into that. But it's also been a time of great repression. I write in my book that Saudi Arabia used to be sort of a soft glove autocracy. You could get together with your friends and you could complain about this. And as long as you weren't sort of plotting protests or building a political party, they would kind of, likely to look the other way. That's definitely changed. Now people are scared. A lot of the Saudis that I got to know during the time when I was going somewhat freely back and forth to the kingdom won't talk to me anymore. When they get together, they put their cell phones in the fridge because they're scared of electronic spying on their conversations. You've had, there's all kinds of stories. Madawi mentioned a number of them. There are people who have been basically disappeared from their families because they ran sarcastic Twitter accounts. I mean, this is something that you didn't have before in Saudi Arabia. And so both of those things, of reform and repression, are, I think, that the two sort of biggest themes that we've seen. And then when you start thinking about Saudi Arabia into the future, and when we try to figure out sort of where is Saudi Arabia going and where is Mohammed bin Salman going, I think it's, what is the balance going to be between those two things? Which, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, as many people in the West do. I think some people think that if you're a reformer, then you must also believe in democracy and political participation. I don't think that's the case. I think there's plenty of examples to the contrary. And I think in terms, I'll just end on this. I think in terms of the future, I think what, Madawi spoke a lot about sort of the political challenges and what she expects to see on the political front. I think the biggest challenges to Mohammed bin Salman and everything that he wants to do are economic. I think he faces tremendous economic challenges. And even though I think he deserves some credit for, I would say, addressing these head on in terms of defining the problem, diagnosing the problem, proposing a number of ways to try to get at this, I think it's very difficult to overestimate the size of the economic challenge to Saudi Arabia. You have a country, 2/3 of its population roughly is under age 30. You have hundreds of thousands of young Saudis entering the job market every year. And the government can't employ them anymore. Historically, the Saudi government has been the largest employer in the kingdom, and they just don't have the money that they used to do. And so, you have Vision 2030, and you have all these other efforts to find ways to diversify the economy. And I think so far, I don't think that the efforts have lived up to the size of the challenge. Certainly COVID-19 is not going to make that any easier. But for me, sort of thinking about the future, I mean, I think we keep an eye on the reforms. Where does that go? We keep an eye on the repression. Where does that go? But for me, I mean, if I were Mohammed bin Salman, the thing that would keep me up at night would be the economy.
Ben, I'm going to take silence to mean completion.
Yes, we can move on to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. Again, a very tantalizing insight into the kind of issues that you are exploring at much greater length in your book. And I'd like to begin the discussion by bringing it back to the frame of analysis that our first speaker, Ala Al-Aswani, gave us when he presented us with the dictatorship syndrome, coming out of his experience in Egypt, but something that he saw as more of a symptom of our times more broadly. And I'm not trying to paint you into describing Saudi Arabia today as a dictatorship. I think that there is an authoritarianism in Saudi Arabia, which is quite distinct. But I'm just wondering whether one element of Aswani's analysis could be brought into the discussion at this point, which is the complicity of society as enablers of authoritarian rule. And I'm very struck. You spoke, Ben, about the fear that you have encountered, but I think there's a generation divide between those who are openly enthusiastic about a reform agenda that they see favoring them and their generation among the 30 and younger, and the people that I know who have shown concern or fear tend to be 40 and above. And so could we talk a little bit about society's role in enabling what is a 5 extraordinary year experiment under MBS, and whether there is a generational divide in that? Madawi?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Eugene. I mean, before Ala Al-Aswani, we know that dictatorship or authoritarian rule doesn't work on its own. It doesn't descend on people. You need to have enablers, and you have to enlist a society. And we know from history of Europe in the 20th century, you know, fascism and all that, we know that, you know, the certain classes, certain categories of citizens participate in the drive to oppress and repress their own fellow citizens. But in my book, in The Sun King, I have done quite a lot of work on the rising of diaspora. Saudi Arabia is experiencing an incipient diaspora, which it has not seen during the affluence of oil in the modern period, at least not in the 20th century. Yes, we had one exile here and there, leaving, going to Egypt. Even princes left. The free princes went to Egypt, then Beirut and Iraq and other places. But what we have seen since 2015 is the rise of a young Saudi diaspora. And this was actually intriguing. If, as the journalist told us, Mohammed bin Salman appeals to this youth cohort. He's a young man who changes his Nokia, dumps the Nokia telephone and gets a smartphone. And you see the crowds at the entertainment venues. You think everybody is supporting Mohammed bin Salman. But I was intrigued to find out, like, why are women feminists leaving Saudi Arabia? Artists, he created MEC, the MEC Foundation, in order to co-opt the artists. So why are artists leaving? We have young women now as asylum seekers in Canada, in the USA, in the Arab world, as far as Australia. Also, we have young men who have actually left.
But these are not people enabling autocracy, if you like. These are people fleeing it. And I wonder whether we could talk about the role of society in encouraging or enabling the great enthusiasm that the under 30s are showing for the personality of MBS and the project.
Absolutely. You have a society that has gone through the two phases I described, the religious nationalism and the pan-Islamism. So in those phases, the person, the agency that is rewarded is the one who can recite the Quran. at age 15, or the one who spreads the Wahhabi mission abroad and he's given prizes. But there is a generational shift, and that's not the work of Mohammed bin Salman. This shift had occurred. If you look at what the Saudis were doing in 2011 during the Arab uprising, their connectedness with their Arab fellows, the way they were articulating their demands for change, you think that Mohammed bin Salman was just a fait accompli that came after the event, after the fact. The art scene in Saudi Arabia was prospering before Mohammed bin Salman. But this cohort had been denied basic human rights, basic entertainment. And it's so obvious that when you open up, you absorb that. And what Mohammed bin Salman is doing is, combining the circus with the bread, but the bread had been stumbling. There's no bread anymore. And he's always asking the youth to be self-reliant. The welfare state is shrinking. So yes, there was the circus. There was the circus of Mohammed bin Salman, and he was the only celebrity in that circus. And everybody had to consume his persona, his celebrity status, and at the same time enjoy the fun. But what they really wanted is jobs. I mean, if you look at the literature that is coming from Saudi Arabia, the unemployment level, the people who are going to universities, the top universities in the kingdom, they're worried they're not finding jobs.
Such as, for talking about Mohammed bin Salman in the past tense here, which is a little optimistic. But let me bring Ben in here and see. Ben, did you have any reflections to add to this?
One thing I would say for context, I think it's almost become sort of a, it's a talking point that you hear all the time, that sort of young Saudis love Mohammed bin Salman, older Saudis are nervous about Mohammed bin Salman. And I think that that's true to a certain extent, but I think it's very difficult and almost impossible to know how true. Saudi Arabia, let's remember, is a place that does not have a free press. It has virtually no civil society that's not controlled by the government, which I guess would mean it's not civil society anyway. No sort of realistically independent, public opinion polling. When journalists or think tankers or researchers go, people know what they're supposed to say, and unless you spend a lot of time there and you get to know people, they're unlikely to sort of tell you, to stray from the official line, because they know what the, they know what the consequences of that could be. Certainly now, after all the repression that we've talked about previously. So I think it's difficult to generalize kind of about who is really on board and who is not. I think it's probably also not entirely correct to assume that all young Saudis are liberals. I'm sure that there are plenty of young conservative Saudis that, yeah, they might think it's cool to go to a movie theater, but then you ask them, well, what do you think about your sister going on a date? And then, their blood pressure goes up and they're no longer as liberal as you thought they were. So I think, I think we have to be very careful about sort of making these sweeping judgments about political opinion. I think we really just are about public opinion. I think we just don't know. And that is what makes it difficult to answer your question about sort of how, if you want to say sort of how culpable are citizens in the authoritarianism that's happening in Saudi Arabia. I think the other thing that it's hard for people in the West to understand is really the tremendous power that the state has over people in Saudi Arabia. I mean, if you're in the West, if you're in the United States or in the UK, or you live somewhere in Europe, and you want to be a dissident, I mean, what does that even mean? I mean, so you disagree with your government, and maybe you're on Twitter, or you have a blog, and your friends think you're kind of weird, and your family, may not invite you to functions, but like nobody cares all that much. Saudi Arabia, becoming a dissident is a major life commitment. I mean, if you're going to take that step, the state has all kinds of means that they can bring down on your head, and that they have increasingly not hesitated to bring down on your head since throughout the rise of Mohammed bin Salman. A lot of this has to do with the power that the state has in the economy. When you look at the number of people who are employed by the state, whether it's in the National Guard, the security services, the bureaucracy, it's not uncommon for when people sort of get out of line to receive a phone call and say, do you know how many of your brothers and cousins work for the government? And this happens. And people know that, like, well, if I don't get in line, that can fall back on my family in kind of a painful way. That's done through tribal structures in more rural or more conservative areas. There's many different ways that they can do this that fall short of sort of what we usually think of a repression, which means they go out and they arrest you and they throw you in prison, which does happen. But there's a whole type of repression that happens below that we don't hear much about. And so that sort of makes it difficult to know who's really on board and who's not, because, you know, when the government has that much ability to kind of shape the way that you behave and the way that you behave publicly, then it sort of forces you to question, you know, when people are on social media praising this and that, or when people are, you know, get interviewed by some researcher who's managed to get a visa to go to Saudi Arabia, it's just very difficult to know. Are they saying what they know they're supposed to be saying? Or are they really being frank with you?
No, and it's,
I just think we need to be a little, there are definitely plenty of citizens who are sort of playing a role in the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, but I think we also need to recognize the tremendous power that the state has to sort of pull people in and to keep them from going outside of that. I mean, another great example of this is you just look at the life of Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, this was a guy who for decades was sort of the consummate insider, and we all know what happened to him when he decided to become an outsider.
Yeah, no, and as I was going to say, it's not a country that's celebrated for its public opinion polling, although it must be said that public opinion polling is not as celebrated as it used to be. I'm going to move on to questions. We have about 25 minutes left before we keep to our 6 1-hour limit to these webinars, and the questions are coming in fast and furious. I already see 22 on the Q&A bar, but I'm going to start with one that comes from Mohammed Lafueras, largely because it's a question that I wanted to put to you, which is another enabler of Mohammed bin Salman's rule-breaking tendencies. His iconoclasm has been this age of rule breakers, and no one more influential in that than Donald Trump. It looks like tonight is the night where we will have a final result that will allow Joe Biden to declare his victory in the presidency, and that the age of Trump now seems to be coming to an end. Could you give us some sense of what the impact of that will be on Saudi Arabia and on Mohammed bin Salman? Will he now have to consider going more by the rules than he did before? Will he no longer have the American support for his way of doing things that seem to facilitate? Ben, we might start with you, and then I'd like to go to Madawi.
Yeah, I really, as a news reporter, I really have to stay out of the fortune-telling business. So I won't. We don't know who's going to win the election, and so I don't want to sort of go too far in saying what a President Joe Biden would or would not do. What we can safely say is that I do think it's safe to say that the Trump administration and its posture towards Saudi Arabia made things much easier for Mohammed bin Salman to basically do whatever he wanted to do. And this started very early in the administration, when Trump basically surprised everybody by deciding to take his first foreign trip as president, not to one of the historic allies, but to go to Saudi Arabia. First time a president has ever done that. And the Saudis took this as a sign of an investment in the relationship, which it was, and they turned it into a massive international summit for the United States and the Islamic world. And so that's kind of where it started off. And then, you also have sort of the relationship between Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman. There's been a lot written about that. When we look at the election, it's hard to imagine that many other American presidents would have been as protective of the Saudis when it comes to things like arms sales and the Yemen war, where you have, I believe, at least two presidential vetoes of legislation that was aimed at stopping arms sales to Saudi Arabia based over the war in Yemen. When you look at the statements that came out of the White House after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, basically saying, yeah, maybe he did it, maybe he didn't, but we don't really care because they're good friends of ours and we really need them. They're really important for us. It's really hard to imagine previous presidents, both Republican and Democrat, doing those kinds of actions. And there has been a lot. Biden has gone on the record quite frequently being critical of the Saudis, both as a senator and during the campaign, saying, we're not going to give them the free pass that they've had in the past. We're going to, we're not going to look the other way at human rights violations. And of course, it's difficult to know how campaign talk sort of, survives the election and makes its way into policy. And so I think the big question, if there is a President Joe Biden starting in January, then I think the question is sort of how much will that talk be translated into policy, and how much will it just have been election talk? This was a sort of a season when being friends with Saudi Arabia was not probably going to win you a lot of votes. It doesn't appear to have costed at the same time, it doesn't appear to have costed Donald Trump many votes. But that's the question that I would be wondering about if we have a change in Washington in January.
Madawi, I'm sure you have plenty to add to that question, but I have a number of questions specifically targeting you. And if I could, I'd like to move on to those so we can address as many of our viewers' questions as possible. Mehdi Askari would like you to explain, now that the goals of Vision 2030 are unattainable, What can replace it, and what are the implications?
Well, I think two important events in the last year that actually derailed Vision 2030. First one is the constant and continuous decline of oil prices, and the second thing was COVID, that closed Saudi Arabia to even pilgrimage, let alone tourism and entertainment and travel. But also before these two hit hard, well, there was Jamal Khashoggi's murder that actually dissuaded many investors to rush to Saudi Arabia, although the three conferences held after the murder of Khashoggi did see some, opportunists who want to actually make the most of this narrow opportunity after others had fallen out of the investment conferences. So yes, Vision 2030 is still there, but it hasn't materialized in the way Mohammed bin Salman would have liked it to. And the future, I think, lies in really what happens to oil prices and how long this COVID problem is going to last. In addition to the changing climate around the world and specifically in the US. I mean, Ben talked about a change of leadership. If it happens in the US by January, obviously Mohammed bin Salman will feel the pressure, not because Biden is going to correct, 70 years of American foreign policy in the Middle East, but he would make enough noise, for example, that may lead, and some people hope that the noises that Biden might make would lead to freeing some kind of prisoners of conscience, opening up the limited freedom of speech in Saudi Arabia. But I don't see a major change that Biden is capable of doing. He's not going to shun Saudi Arabia now. I mean, the whole world economy is is a disaster. And the last thing that the US wants is to sort of put more pressure on Saudi Arabia. So let's be realistic. A Democrat in the White House is not going to transform this sort of so-called historical alliance. Obviously, the US will continue to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, especially if we have a predatory China and Russia. What might happen is Saudi Arabia would be put under more pressure to reach a kind of reconciliation with Iran and lower the threshold of violence in the Arab world and the competition between the two countries. So I think that is important. And then there remains the question that of the normalization with Israel. I don't know whether Biden will go along the same path treaded by Trump and put more pressure on Saudi Arabia to follow the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and the others.
Let me stop you there only to throw another question at you. This one from Anne Irfan. She would like you to expand on the elements of MBS's promoted nationalism that make it populist. So could you develop that part of your discussion about the populist side of MBS's nationalism?
It is populist because it fires at people, very much like what Trump has been doing, really. I mean, these hashtags that he uses, Saudi Arabia for Saudis, make Saudi Arabia great, Saudi al-Udma. All these are tagged and hashtagged that promote this kind of populism. His appearances during sort of entertainment venues when people are supposed to actually watch what is going on, whether it's a boxing match or a race car, and Saudi Arabia is going to host Formula One for the first time. These are the events that are used for this populist nationalism to appeal to the primitive sort of bottom line of people's emotions. And it's not a kind of a nationalism that, is similar to what Michel Aflaq was doing in Syria and Iraq, that tries to sort of rewrite the history of the Arab Arab nation or Sata al-Husari even. It is a kind of primitive populist nationalism for consumption, instantaneous consumption, and social media helps with that. So I don't see this rigid nationalism of the 1960s. I see a different kind of nationalism that is in tune with the means of its own transmission, that works on social media, that works on television, that works in these kind of live venues. And it lacks a serious theorization, and it's very, very contested. The people who can talk, they still can't switch. I interviewed people who were of the older generation, but they're not very old. They're still in their 40s and 50s. And they were saying, like, you know, I remember when I was a child at school, I had to chant Islamic recitations and anashid to promote the Ummah, the Islamic Ummah, and promote Palestine and Jerusalem. And now I'm expected to promote Al-Ula, and it is not easy for people to switch from that kind of pan-Islamic outlook of the Saudis are the vanguards who go and spread Islam. They're not the ones who consume, you know, pop culture inside the country. And this is the kind of populism that is actually very, very crude and basic.
Thank you.
But it has the power. It has the power to mobilize.
As we've seen. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to bat your way, Ben. First off, from Dr. Sarah El-Rishani, who are Mohammed bin Salman's rivals in Saudi Arabia today? And do they still present a credible challenge after their sojourn in the Ritz-Carlton?
I mean, I think from what we know, I don't think he has any serious rivals to speak of. I mean, you could say, you know, Mohammed bin Nayef was a rival for a period. You know, maybe Muttab bin Abdullah was a rival for a period. I mean, these were just because these were other people who were kind of in senior positions in the royal family and had significant government positions as well. But they were all, you know, these people were all sufficiently sort of disarmed, isolated, in some cases incarcerated, fairly early in his rise. And I just, you know, I mean, I don't want to say that I think it's over for Mohammed bin Salman, but if there is going to be a significant challenge, it's very hard to see where it would come from now. Saudi Arabia is not, you know, certainly has no history of sort of military coups or anything like that. It's very difficult to see. I mean, the fact that he has managed during his rise to really restructure how power is exercised and bring all the levers into his own hands. I mean, from the National Guard to the intelligence services, the Interior Ministry, the military. It's just very hard to see that even if there are and there certainly are other princes who are not happy with the way this has happened, it's very hard to see where they're going to get the resources to pose a significant challenge to him.
And building on that, I mean, do you foresee there being any flashpoint for opposition in the long run over the Saudi intervention in Yemen? Does this fit into the narrative of populist nationalism? Are there comparisons to be made between what Saudi Arabia is going through and what's going on in the Vietnam War? By extension, could there be a kind of movement against the war which would weigh down MBS and his popularity?
You want me to answer that, Eugene?
Madawi, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, the war of Yemen was probably the flagship of Mohammed bin Salman, in inverted commas, because it is that context that sort of promoted this populist nationalism, that we are attacked. But you have to realize that in Saudi Arabia, Yemen is a very long way, and it was not felt, the war, in Riyadh, Mecca, Jeddah, Dammam, the eastern province, as much as it would have had there been, you know, a close proximity. But it did become real when the Houthi missiles started arriving in Riyadh and in Jeddah, and also the oil fields were bombed. It did create that momentum, that sort of moment where we are targeted by the foreign enemy. And there was a lot of solidarity, but it's the whole point of the war of Yemen is not discussed. you cannot criticize the war. You do not know even what's going on the borders. And you have to look at that sort of area, Najran, Jazan, all of that, and what has happened in it. There are lots of exiles who had come out of that area. And there is a shift in the population composition of these places. Many of the local inhabitants had been moved to the north, and it actually started during the King Abdullah when there was an incident with the Ismaili community. Also, the residents there, the people who live in these areas, are very, very upset that their area is flooded by foreign soldiers, Pakistanis, Jordanians, Egyptians, generals, and they don't feel secure being there. They told me in these interviews that they don't want their daughters to go in the streets because they're foreign soldiers in these cities on the border. So the war in Yemen was important for the populist nationalism, and it was used quite a lot to the extent of sending women journalists with the army, in addition to religious scholars, to promote Saudi nationalism. And you see women in military attire on top of tanks reporting and talking to the soldiers. So this is the populist nationalism I'm talking about. And in addition, you get a traditional religious scholar who would go to the front and talk and mobilize the soldiers on the basis that they are fighting a jihad against the Zaydi Houthis. So all these contradictions are there, but it's very difficult to see how the war on Yemen would precipitate any kind of agitations inside the country. First, people can't actually give their opinion about the war.
Thank you, Madawi. Ben, I'm sure you could answer that one, but I'm going to bat another one your way to keep the questions moving. We have from Diana Galayeva a question about Saudi Russian relations. And what do you see the future of relations between Saudi Arabia and Russia, given the close ties between Putin and MBS?
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have probably a very sophisticated answer for that. I mean, the only context I could provide is that, you know, MBS has made an effort to sort of diversify Saudi Arabia's foreign relations, and this includes sort of high-profile trips to China. The king himself actually went to Russia, which was a huge, you know, that was something that had not happened for many, many decades. Where it goes in the future, I don't know. I mean, I'm you know, won't try to predict that, but I think that MBS has sort of seen, I think part of it has to do with you sort of diversifying away from just being so dependent on the United States and the UK. And I also think it has to do with him, you know, this, you know, perhaps plays into the sort of nationalism idea, but I think he also wants Saudi Arabia to be a great power. You know, they're very excited this year to get the presidency of the G20, and I think that he believes, as you know, for Saudi Arabia to play what he believes is their proper role in the world, they need to have relations with these other large powers. Where it goes in the future, I don't know. I mean, certainly the oil war didn't particularly help. You know, the price war earlier this year certainly didn't help relations, but you know, we'll have to wait and see where it goes.
Thank you, Ben. Look, I'm going to confess at this point to our viewers that I'm a bit of an interloper tonight. As both Ben and Madawi know, this event was organized by my colleague, Usaama Al-Azami, and he was meant to be the moderator, and his technology has failed him until this moment. I can see his face now on the screen. And actually, I've had a number of the questions in the question bar coming from Usaama. So better late than never, Usaama. Could I invite you to ask one of your questions to bring the evening to a close?
Thank you very much, Eugene. And I apologize to everyone. I spent a great deal of time on social media saying that I would be hosting this event. So it is a bit of an embarrassment for me that I'm showing up so late to my own sort of event. But I've really been delighted to be able to sort of listen to both of you, learn a great deal. I'm really looking forward to Madawi's book, and I have you know, had a wonderful experience reading Ben's book probably around 4 or 5 months ago now. But in a sense, you know, my question, I think, or some of my questions have already been answered. You know, my major sort of question was relating to the possibility that something would actually happen with respect to Jamal Khashoggi, and I think that has kind of been addressed. That, and I think I can recognize Madawi's point that there's not really much in it for a Biden presidency to try and sort of go for that. Another dimension which I'm curious about is what a potential Biden presidency would do with respect to the relationship with Israel. As you all know, fairly recently, the embassy was moved to Jerusalem. Is there a chance that Biden will try to reset that relationship somewhat with Netanyahu by trying to move the embassy away from it, or is that now a fait accompli? This is a question for either one of you. It's not actually, but I would be interested to hear Ben's response, perhaps, as the American.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't predict what a potential Biden as president would do. I don't see any reason to. I mean, I don't know if a future administration would pursue new normalization deals kind of as assertively as the Trump administration has. I certainly have no reason to think that a different administration would, look down on these deals or try to undo them, or would not even welcome further deals. I mean, if Saudi Arabia decided to normalize with Israel, I don't think a Biden administration is going to condemn that or be, that's something that I think they would welcome as well. So I don't know if I can say much more, how he would interact with Netanyahu. We would have to wait and see.
Right, and I don't know if Madawi, you wanted to add anything to that. We have about 5 minutes. So
I think the pressure will probably be less on MBS to rush to a normalization along the lines of the one with the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan. So I think Mohammed bin Salman will be relieved if Biden doesn't put pressure, because he could maintain secret under the table relations with Israel, which had been going on for a long time now, especially if the target is Iran. They share intelligence, there's a transfer of technology, and he prefers to keep it that way. But I mean, to think that Mohammed bin Salman is going to rush and have the Israeli flag in Riyadh just to sort of move fast, I think his loss, he will be counting his loss. And he gains more by keeping the relationship under the table. There's no rush to do anything about that. So he might face some pressure with regard to the repression that is taking place at home. And we still don't know what the advisors to Biden, should he become the president in a couple of months, whether they will revive their interest, the arms of the US state, such as the CIA or the foreign office, whether they would revise their interest in Mohammed bin Nayef, although Mohammed bin Nayef seems to me as redundant now, simply on the basis of his cooperation in the war on terror. He had medals from the CIA, etc. And as Europe now is going through a wave of terrorism, I don't know how that is going to develop, and whether the US will be the next or the coming target, and how would Biden react to that? We have to wait and see. It's very difficult to predict.
I mean, in some sense, the Biden presidency could be a boon to Mohammed bin Salman, despite all the ways in which, I mean, with respect to Israel specifically, I think that's what you're suggesting, that it actually relieves some of the pressure of having to maintain that cordial relationship with the Trumps and Jared Kushner and all the rest of them. I think at the same time, the sort of other aspects of that relationship that you outlined can create other kinds of pressures that perhaps weren't present under a Trump presidency. I'm really conscious we have literally 1 minute left. I'm very curious about one particular question, which either of you can take. And if Eugene gives me the signal, I will go on with this question, which is perfect. Thank you, Eugene. And basically, this is about the relationship with Abu Dhabi, and specifically with MBZ. So Viresh Joshi asks, much has been made of MBZ in Abu Dhabi being a mentor of MBS. Indeed, many think that MBZ is the brains behind MBS's sort of rise. Does this crude populist brand of populism also manifest in the UAE? And if so, how do the two relate to each other, particularly in the context of the war in Yemen?
Yeah, well, I think this populist nationalism is also elsewhere in the region, Qatar, especially under the sanctions of the Saudis and the Emiratis. But I think, I mean, your question reminds me of a conversation I had with an Emirati academic a long time ago. And I asked him, what is it for the UAE to promote Mohammed bin Salman? And eventually he's going to be a competitor. I mean, the Saudi economically, in terms of the Saudi market, in terms of the capabilities. Yes, the UAE is important, but it is a small country in the grand scheme of things, and doesn't have the historical sort of symbolic capital that Saudi Arabia has. And he said to me, it is basically the Arab uprisings. And if the Arab uprisings reach Saudi Arabia, then they become a danger in the UAE.
Right.
If we wanted to defeat the Wahhabi tradition that threatens our way of life in Dubai and elsewhere, we have to defeat it in Saudi Arabia. Hence, the interest of MBZ in MBS. And if MBS continues with his social reforms.
Thank you very much. I mean, that really is an interesting perspective, because it's looking at the Wahhabi dimension as being a major concern for MBZ specifically. And that's not an analysis that you come across very often. I'm going to very sadly have to bring things to a swift conclusion at this point. I'd like to extend my thanks to Madawi and Ben for really giving us a lot of food for thought. And I hope encouraging many of us to go out and read their books, or in the case of Madawi, her forthcoming book. She edited a volume, of course, on Salman's legacy recently. And I'd also like to extend very warm thanks to Eugene for really rescuing this sort of podcast when my system crashed on me earlier this evening. But you've all really been sort of a wonderful audience as well, asking many questions. We're very sorry not to have been able to go through all of them, but I'm sure there will be future opportunities in which we can have more discussions with some of our own guests and some of the same sorts of themes going forward. So with that, I'd like to, again, thank you all for joining us, thank the panelists, and look forward to seeing you in the near future. Take care. Bye-bye.